America's national forests are realms of paradox. Vast, untamed expanses where nature unfurls in a breathtaking sprawl of towering pines and sprawling oaks, their branches weaving a canopy that filters sunlight into a tapestry of shadow and gleam. Streams carve silver veins through the underbrush, their murmurs a soft counterpoint to the silence that settles over these wilds. A silence so profound it feels alive, pressing against the senses like a weight too vast to name. These are landscapes of solace and savagery, their beauty a fragile veneer stretched taut over a pulse that thrums with the echoes of time. Time that has cradled the footsteps of the lost, the hunted, and the hunting. For the park rangers who tread these paths, boots crunching through carpets of fallen leaves, radios crackling with static at their belts, rifles slung over shoulders like silent promises. The forest is both a sanctuary and a crucible, a place where they serve as guardians and, at times, unwitting prey. Most days unfold in a rhythm of routine, guiding disoriented hikers back to safety, dousing smoldering campfires left by the careless, shooing bears from ransacked tents with a practiced shout. But in the shadowed corners of these woods, Ozark, Gifford Pinchot, North Cascades, Olympic, Kettle Moraine, and Blackwood, some rangers have crossed a threshold into nightmares that defy the maps they clutch, tales of blood-stained earth, trees scarred with claw marks, and eyes that gleam with a malice that transcends reason. These are not campfire fables spun to thrill restless campers or fleeting shadows born of exhaustion. They are raw, jagged accounts of survival, etched into the earth with the evidence of terror, footprints too large to be human, bones scattered in grotesque heaps, relics that pulse with a curse older than the trails themselves. This is the chronicle of rangers who stared into the abyss, a descent into America's haunted wilds where the forest hungers and the line between protector and prey frays into threads of shadow and dread. Hank Collins, The Ozark Creature's Relentless Hunt. Ozark National Forest in Arkansas sprawls across rugged hills like a living organism, its terrain a labyrinth of steep slopes and hidden hollows cloaked in dense stands of pine and oak. The trees rise like ancient sentinels, their bark rough and weathered, their roots sinking deep into soil that hums with the quiet of centuries. A quiet broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant call of a hawk slicing through the sky. For Hank Collins, a park ranger whose 15 years of service had carved lines into his weathered hands and a steady resolve into his gray eyes, this forest was a second home, a refuge from the clamor of a world he'd long since learned to tune out. On a clear, brisk Monday morning in the summer of 2018, he set out on his rounds, the air sharp with the scent of resin and the faint tang of dew still clinging to the underbrush. His thermos of coffee sloshed in his pack, its bitter warmth a ritual he savored, while his radio hung clipped to his belt, its occasional crackle a tether to the ranger station miles away. The trails unfolded before him in familiar patterns. Whitaker Point, Sugar Creek, the winding paths he'd walked 1,000 times, each step a communion with the serenity that only nature could weave into his bones. The morning passed in a rhythm of small tasks, checking trail signs for wear, kicking aside fallen branches that might trip an unwary hiker, pausing to sip his coffee and let the forest stillness wash over him. The pines stretched upward, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, rust-colored blanket, while the oaks twisted into gnarled shapes that cast long, cool shadows across the dirt. Around noon, the radio crackled to life, shattering the calm with a burst of static. Karen's voice cut through, tense and clipped, a tone that prickled Hank's instincts. "Hank, we've got a situation at the northwest edge of the park. Can you come over?" Curiosity flared, edged with a flicker of unease. Karen was a veteran, her calm unshaken even by emergencies, her voice a steady anchor in chaos. "On my way," he replied, swinging into his Jeep, the engine's low growl a stark intrusion against the forest's hush. He drove through winding paths, tires crunching over gravel and snapping twigs, the canopy overhead filtering sunlight into a dim, dappled glow that danced across the dashboard. When he arrived, Karen stood beside a cluster of campers, the Thomas family, near a trailhead marked by a weathered signpost half swallowed by vines. A middle-aged couple and their teenage son, their faces etched with a raw, visceral dread that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The man paced, boots scuffing the dirt, his hands clenching and unclenching as if trying to grasp something lost. The woman hovered near him, her eyes red-rimmed, teetering on the edge of tears. The boy stood apart, staring into the woods with a pallor that made him look like a ghost haunting his own skin. "Hank, this is the Thomas family," Karen said, her voice steady but her hazel eyes sharp with urgency. "They reported a missing person. Their daughter, Lily." Hank nodded, projecting a calm he didn't fully feel, his chest tightening as he met their gazes. "Can you tell me what happened?" Mr. Thomas stopped pacing, turning to face Hank, his voice raw and frayed at the edges. "We were hiking Whitaker Point Trail. Lily was ahead of us. She always is, loves exploring, running off to see what's around the next bend. We lost sight of her for just a minute, turned a corner, and she was gone." His wife gripped his arm, her knuckles white, her voice trembling as she added, "It was quiet, too quiet. We didn't hear anything unusual. No screams, no rustling, just nothing." Hank exchanged a glance with Karen, the words sinking into him like stones into still water. Whitaker Point was a jewel of the Ozark, breathtaking vistas of cliffs plunging into valleys, rock outcrops framing views that stretched to the horizon. But its terrain was a treacherous maze of steep drops, tangled roots, and sudden turns that could swallow the careless whole. "We'll start a search," he said, his tone firm, a lifeline for the family's fraying hope. "Tell us what she was wearing, where you last saw her. Every detail helps." They spent the rest of the day combing the area, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows that stretched across the pines like fingers reaching for the fading light. Hank moved methodically, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam over the earth, searching for footprints, a scrap of cloth, a broken twig, anything to mark Lily's passage. But the forest offered nothing. No tracks pressed into the dirt, no signs of a struggle, no whisper of where she'd gone. It was as if the ground had opened and swallowed her whole, leaving only the oppressive silence that clung to the trees. The woods, usually teeming with life, squirrels skittering through the underbrush, birds chattering overhead, felt wrong, their absence a void that gnawed at Hank's gut, a sensation he couldn't name but couldn't shake. Night fell hard as they returned to the ranger station, the search yielding only exhaustion and a creeping unease that settled into Hank's bones like damp cold. Missing persons weren't unheard of. Hikers wandered off trails, twisted ankles, got lost in the labyrinthine wilds. But this was different, a disappearance too clean, too absolute. Dawn broke gray and heavy, bringing a search and rescue team in a flurry of boots and barking dogs, their voices calling Lily's name into the void, the sound swallowed by the forest's unrelenting quiet. Hank joined them, his legs aching but his resolve unbroken, combing ridges and hollows, peering into crevices where the shadows pooled thick and dark. Days dragged on, each one a slow bleed of hope, the Thomases setting up a makeshift camp near the station. Tents staked into the earth, faces hollowed by grief, their eyes fixed on the woods as if willing Lily to emerge. On the fourth day, Hank patrolled alone near Whitaker Point Trail, the air cooler now, the sun a faint glow behind a veil of clouds. A faint rustling broke the stillness, like leaves stirred by a breath too deliberate, too measured, and his pulse quickened, instincts screaming to turn back. But duty, that iron thread woven through his years as a ranger, pushed him deeper, the trees closing in around him, their branches clawing at the sky, sunlight dwindling to a dim, greenish haze that pressed against his eyes. Then he saw it, crouched by a stream, a figure drinking with slow, deliberate sips, its silhouette framed against the water's glinting surface. His heart leapt. Lily! The word a whisper on his lips, hope flaring bright and brief. But as he crept closer, boots silent on the mossy earth, the illusion shattered into fragments of dread. It was humanoid, yes, but its skin was a sickly gray, mottled and taut over bones too sharp, limbs too long and too thin, bent at angles that defied nature's design. It wore tattered rags, patches of cloth scavenged from forgotten places, stained with dirt and something darker, hanging off its frame like a shroud. Its head turned, and its eyes met his black, empty voids, twin pits that swallowed light and reflected nothing, piercing him with a gaze that sent a surge of primal fear coursing through his veins, freezing his blood in his chest. He stood rooted, breath shallow, hand fumbling for the radio at his belt. But before he could press the button, it lunged, a low growl rumbling from its chest like thunder rolling through a hollow cave. It tackled him to the ground, the impact driving the air from his lungs, claws raking across his chest with a searing pain that tore through muscle and fabric alike. Blood soaked his shirt, warm and sticky, as he thrashed beneath its weight, its strength unnatural, a force that pinned him like prey beneath a predator's jaws. He kicked out, boots connecting with its sinewy frame, and it recoiled just enough for him to scramble free, rolling to his knees, hand clawing for the knife at his side, the only weapon he carried, its blade a frail glimmer of steel against the dark. They circled each other, the creature's gaze unyielding, its movements fluid yet jerky, a hunter sizing up its kill. It struck again, claws slashing his leg, sending him sprawling into the dirt, pain a white-hot flare that blurred his vision. He swung the knife blindly, the blade biting into its arm, black blood oozing from the wound, thick and viscous, dripping onto the earth like tar. It snarled but didn't slow, its claws poised for another strike. A shout split the air. Karen burst through the trees, her flashlight's beam cutting through the gloom like a spear, her service pistol barking a deafening shot that echoed off the pines. The creature recoiled, its growl twisting into a hiss, and it fled into the shadows, vanishing as swiftly as it had appeared, leaving Hank gasping, blood pooling beneath him, the forest swallowing the sound of its retreat. Karen rushed to his side, dropping to her knees, her face pale but her hands steady as she pressed a cloth to his chest. "Hank, are you okay? What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her calm. "I don't know," he rasped, wincing as pain lanced through him. "But we need to get back now." She helped him up, his arms slung over her shoulder, and they staggered to the jeep, the forest looming around them like a living thing, its silence heavier than ever. Back at the station, medics swarmed, their voices a blur as they patched him up. Deep gashes across his chest and leg, stitches pulling tight against torn flesh. But he'd live, they said, though the words felt hollow. He told Karen and the others what he'd seen. A humanoid creature, gray-skinned, black-eyed, lurking in the Ozark wilds. But the story sounded insane even to his own ears, a nightmare spilled into the waking world. Yet the wounds were real, the blood on his shirt a testament, the terror etched into his bones a scar he couldn't unfeel. Sleep eluded him that night, the creature's eyes haunting the dark behind his lids, its growl a whisper in the silence. Next dawn, despite the pain throbbing through his stitched flesh, he insisted on returning with Karen, the forest now a menacing sprawl, every rustle of leaves a threat, every shadow a promise of something watching. They searched all day, the sun a faint glow sinking toward the horizon, casting an eerie light through the canopy. Near dusk, Hank spotted a glint in the underbrush, a small silver bracelet tangled among the roots, its surface engraved with Lily in delicate script. "Karen, over here!" he called, voice tight, and she hurried over, her face paling as she saw it. "We're close," she murmured, and they followed a trail of disturbed foliage, broken twigs, scuffed earth, leading deeper into the woods, their hearts pounding in unison. A faint cry pierced the air, weak but unmistakable, and they broke into a run, boots pounding the dirt, branches snapping underfoot. They burst into a clearing, and there she was, Lily, tied to a tree with frayed rope, her clothes torn and streaked with dirt, her face pale but alive, tears cutting trails through the grime on her cheeks. "Lily, it's okay, we're here," Hank said, kneeling to untie her, his voice a forced calm as his trembling hands worked the knots. She whispered a choked thank you, clutching his arm as the ropes fell away, but a growl rumbled behind them, low and menacing. Hank turned, and the creature loomed at the clearing's edge, its black eyes glinting with malice, its gray frame taut with intent. "Run!" he shouted, shoving Lily toward Karen, adrenaline surging as they sprinted through the forest, the creature's growls close on their heels, its footsteps a relentless thud against the earth. Branches clawed at their faces. Roots snagged their boots, but they pushed on, the jeep a distant beacon of salvation. Just as they reached it, the creature lunged, tackling Karen to the ground in a tangle of limbs and snarls. Hank spun, knife in hand, but Karen rolled free, her pistol barking another shot that hit the creature square in the chest. It let out a guttural scream, collapsing in a heap, black blood pooling beneath it, and they didn't wait to see if it was dead. They piled into the jeep, Hank flooring the gas as they sped back to the station, tires screeching on gravel. They locked the doors, called for backup, and waited, breath ragged, as the authorities arrived. An hour later, the forest swarming with flashlights and radios. Lily reunited with her family, their relief a palpable wave, but the creature was gone. No body, no trace, only the memory of its eyes and claws etched into Hank's mind. A week later, he handed in his resignation, the paper trembling in his hands as he signed it. The forest, once his peace, now whispered nightmares, of black voids staring from the dark, of claws raking flesh, of a shadow he'd escaped but could never unsee. He moved to Oregon, far from the woods, but the Ozarks' call lingered, a haunting echo he'd carry to his grave. Patrick O'Neill, the Gifford Pinchot Cave of Forgotten Souls. Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington stretches across volcanic slopes and dense woodlands, its terrain a rugged sprawl of pines and hidden caves carved by time and the earth's restless shifts. For Patrick O'Neill, a ranger born and raised in the small town of Kelso, Washington, this forest was a thread woven through his life, childhood fishing trips with his father along its streams, the peace of open skies under its towering trees, the adventure of its wilds calling him to a career that felt as natural as breathing. In the summer of 2014, 10 years into his tenure, the forest felt heavier, the air thick with an unspoken tension that pressed against his chest, a sensation he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. On a Monday morning, he set out on his rounds, the sun a faint glow behind a veil of clouds, the campgrounds and trailheads quiet under his watchful eye. His boots crunched over pine needles as he checked sights, the routine a comfort. Empty fire pits, a stray candy wrapper fluttering in the breeze, until he stumbled on an abandoned campsite near a remote trailhead. The tent was slashed open, its nylon flaps hanging like torn flesh, the campfire long gone cold, ash scattered across the dirt. A car sat untouched nearby, keys glinting in the ignition, a detail that twisted his gut. Maybe a bear spooked them and they ran off, he muttered, radioing it in. His voice steady but the words hollow against the static that swallowed them in the spotty reception. He marked the location on his map, the unease gnawing deeper, a splinter he couldn't pull free. The forest was silent. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just a suffocating stillness that prickled the hairs on his neck, a feeling of being watched he couldn't shake. The next day, driven by that unease, he hiked deeper, following a barely visible trail branching from the campsite, a ribbon of earth swallowed by overgrown ferns and thorns that snagged at his clothes. Claw marks gouged the trees, deep and jagged, their edges fresh, while splashes of dried blood stained the underbrush, dark against the green. His pulse quickened, the silence growing heavier, the forest a labyrinth of shadow and quiet that seemed to hold its breath. Ahead loomed a cave, its entrance half hidden by moss and ivy, a dark maw that exhaled a chill into the warm air. "Hello? Anyone there?" he called, flashlight piercing the gloom, his voice echoing off damp walls, answered only by the steady drip of water into unseen pools. He stepped inside, the air cold and thick with dampness, the smell of decay curling into his lungs, a sour, rotting stench that made his stomach churn. Deeper in, the flashlight's beam revealed a nightmare. Bones littered the floor, human and animal, a grotesque jumble of cracked femurs, shattered skulls, and ribs tangled with shreds of cloth. Wallets, watches, a child's backpack, personal belongings scattered like offerings to some forgotten god, lay among the remains, evidence of brutal, relentless force. His mind raced. Bear? Cougar? Human? But the scene defied reason, a slaughter too methodical, too vast. A noise behind him, A shuffle, heavy and deliberate, froze his thoughts, and he turned, the beam trembling in his grip. It stood at the entrance, humanoid but wrong, its skin a sickly gray stretched tight over jagged bones, its eyes glowing a haunting yellow in the dark, silent and predatory, its presence a weight that crushed the air from the cave. He ran, flashlight bouncing wildly, heart slamming against his ribs as its heavy footsteps thudded behind, a relentless rhythm that echoed off the walls. He burst into daylight, tripping over a root, sprawling into the dirt as its claws sank into his shoulder, pain exploding through him like fire. "Get off me, you bastard!" he screamed, kicking and punching, fighting a nightmare made flesh. Somehow he broke free, scrambling to his feet, blood streaming down his arm, and sprinted to the ranger station, slamming the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. "This is Ranger O'Neill. I need backup at Gifford Pinchot. There's something out here, killing people," he shouted into the radio, voice shaking but desperate, praying the message cut through the static. Hours passed, the creature scratching at the walls and windows, its claws a grating rasp against the wood, until a helicopter roared overhead, armed rangers and law enforcement storming in. It fled, its blood-curdling scream echoing as they found Patrick huddled in a corner, bloodied but alive. They uncovered more bodies, more signs. Caves turned graves, but no trace of the creature. Driven by a need to end it, Patrick researched, unearthing an old legend of a cursed spirit bound by a relic. He returned, retracing his steps, finding a stone altar beneath an ancient tree, a weathered box holding a twisted bone carved with strange symbols. As he grabbed it, the creature's growl rumbled behind, its claws reaching. He threw the bone into a stream, watching it dissolve as the creature screamed, its body collapsing into the water, vanishing in a ripple of black. The forest quieted, but Patrick remained a ranger, vigilant, its yellow eyes a shadow he'd never escape. Jack Landry, the North Cascades silent predator. North Cascades National Park in Washington unfurls in a rugged sprawl of jagged peaks and fiery foliage. Its trails a haven for Jack Landry after a rough patch in Seattle. Lost job, broken ties, a need for solitude that drew him to the mountains. In late September 2016, with Tom Jenkins, a younger ranger whose jokes lightened their tedious rounds, he patrolled Copper Creek Trail, the forest quiet under a setting sun that painted the leaves in hues of red and gold. The radio hummed old rock tunes as they drove the dirt road, tires crunching gravel, talk turning to a missing hiker, experienced, yet vanished a week prior. "Weird he'd get lost," Jack said, unease flickering. Tom grinned. Maybe Bigfoot got him. But the laugh felt forced against the silence creeping in. At the trailhead, they parked, flashlights in hand, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows through the pines. 2 miles in, trampled underbrush and deep gouges in the earth stopped them. Too wide, too deliberate for a bear. "These don't look right," Tom said, kneeling, his voice tight. Jack's chill deepened, the air growing heavy, the forest's quiet oppressive. Darkness fell, their beams slicing through shadows, Tom's banter fading as the trees closed in. Rounding a bend, a figure stood off the path, tall, gray, its skin mottled, claws glinting, eyes glowing in the light. It lunged at Tom. Jack shoved him aside, claws raking his arm, blood welling hot and fast. "Run!" he shouted, pushing Tom down the trail as they sprinted, the creature's breath a rasp behind them. In a clearing, it circled Jack, Tom fleeing for help, its movements a predatory grace. It struck again, claws sinking into his side, pain a blinding flare. Then it paused, head snapping up, and vanished into the trees. Jack lay bleeding, fighting to stay conscious, until Tom returned with a search party, their voices a lifeline as they airlifted him out. The creature eluded them, its legend growing among hikers, haunting Jack and Tom's vigilant patrols, a shadow etched into their bond. Hank Grover, the Olympic watcher's unseen gaze. Olympic National Park's dense woods were Hank Grover's roots, a ranger born in Port Angeles, the forest an extension of his childhood. In 2012, amid a string of vanishings, He investigated near Lake Et after hikers reported an eerie figure. An abandoned campsite, tent shredded, items strewn, set his nerves alight. A huge, clawed footprint leading deeper. A growl echoed, and it lunged, pale, translucent, milky-eyed, pinning him until bear spray drove it back. He fled, later spotting it outside his home, wounding it with a shotgun. But it vanished, its tracks a lingering threat, the watcher a terror he'd forever feel watching. Daniel Everett. The Kettle Moraine's bone-laden nest. Kettle Moraine State Forest in Wisconsin blazed with fall colors in October 2018 as Daniel Everett patrolled remote trails. A growl revealing an abandoned campsite. Claw marks fresh, a gray, yellow-eyed creature lunging. He escaped, but it attacked again on the road, denting his truck. With Sarah and Mike, he found its cave. A nest of bones, missing hikers' relics, and shot it dead. Its death a grim answer, the forest's peace a lost echo. Daniel Barker and Andy Carmichael. The Ozark and Blackwood Nightmares. In 2017 Ozark, Daniel Barker and Emily faced a fur-clad creature at a cabin, its claws taking her before he stabbed it dead, resigning in dread. In 2003 Blackwood, Andy Carmichael saved Linda Torres from a bark-skinned beast in a cave, killing it with a rifle, its mystery a dark stain on their lives.
What would you do, reader, if you stood at the threshold of those woods, the air thick with whispers and unseen eyes? Could you bear the weight of their secrets? Or would you flee, leaving the shadows to fester? The forbidden excavation dares you to imagine, because some stories don't end with the dawn. They linger, threading through the dark, waiting for the next soul to listen.